Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for coming indoors on such a beautiful, beautiful day. I'm Kenneth Lapatin, Curator of Antiquities here at the Getty Villa, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation. Our lecture this afternoon focuses on the site of Palmyra, and as you know, in recent years, wars across the Middle East have irrevocably damaged many ancient sites, and none more so than that caravan city, famed as a meeting place of civilization since its height in the late 3rd century. Palmyra was a wealthy oasis functioning as a center of culture and trade at the edge of the Roman and Parthian empires, and its ruins, like all ruins, have stood for ages as bearers of meaning, marking their place in history. And over time, traveling artists and explorers have documented the sites in various states of preservation. The Getty Research Institute at the Getty Center possesses a collection of rare 18th century prints and 19th century photographs, including some of the earliest, if not the earliest, photographs of the site. And these will be presented on an online-only exhibition early next year, curated by my colleagues at the Research Institute, Peter Bonfito and Fran Turpak. And it is that exhibition and its online presentation that this lecture will form a part. Today at the Villa, we are especially pleased to welcome Rubina Raja, who is Professor of Classical Archaeology at Aarhus University in Denmark. Professor Raja was trained in Copenhagen, Rome, and Oxford, and has held postdoctoral fellowships in Germany and Denmark before being appointed chair of classical archaeology at Aarhus, and she is also the director of the Danish National Research Foundation's Center of Excellence for Urban Network Evolutions. She initiated and currently leads the Palmyra Portrait Project, which is financed by the Carlsberg Foundation. So I encourage you, whenever you get the choice, drink Carlsberg beer. This is not a joke, because the money goes to the Carlsberg Foundation and goes to support important research and documentation projects like the one Professor Raja leads. She also directs an international excavation project at Gerasa in modern Jordan. She has published extensively on urban development in the ancient world, religion in the Roman period, as well as Roman portraiture. Her impressive curriculum vitae lists over 100 publications, so I'm not going to read any of those to you because we'd be here all afternoon. And she is also the recipient of numerous prestigious grants and awards. Her talk today is entitled "The Palmyra Portrait Project, Preserving Cultural Heritage in a Time of Conflict." Please join me in welcoming Rubina Raja to the Getty Villa.
Well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I hope the talk lives up to the expectations, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. It's a great pleasure to be here. The lecture is very much about a project which I did not realize would have the impact that it actually came to have. So it's very much about why humanities in the world that we live in still matters a lot. And it really shows the importance of why classical documentation projects might end up holding significant importance for how we understand and see the world, and also, unfortunately, lose things that we think we are going to have for forever. Palmyra, also called Pearl of the Desert, had been a legendary site long before it was rediscovered in the 18th century, in particular because we have ancient sources telling us about its legendary Queen Zenobia, who also became the downfall of the city. So it was featured in European art, literature, and also music, actually before it was rediscovered. But also after the rediscovery of Palmyra, Zenobia in particular and Palmyra kept on being a theme in art, literature, and music. And you see one of the pre-Raphaelite paintings here of Zenobia casting a last look on Palmyra before she is taken to Rome, which one of the sources tells us is what happened to her. There are even operas about Zenobia from the 18th century. Rossini did one, which was last actually shown in Europe in 2013. There are very modern musicals also in the Gulf area these days that actually show a revival of this tradition and focus on Zenobia as this powerful queen of the Middle East. And here you see a wonderful drawing also from the early 19th century when the opera by Rossini premiered at La Scala in Italy. The site was really rediscovered by British travelers in 1751. They set out on an expedition from Aleppo, where they were doing trade, and rediscovered Palmyra. And such findings and drawings really helped inform the taste for the neoclassical Reformation that was sweeping Europe at this time. And here we see Wood and Dawkins in the moment of rediscovering Palmyra. Here's the very famous Triumphal Arch, which is unfortunately one of the monuments that have been destroyed in the last years. And you see them here represented in their wonderful, colorful riding boots and Roman togas. I'm not sure that that was what they were in fact wearing at the point in time, but goes to sort of feed into this neoclassical picture of the Near East. This was also the point in time where the rich funerary portraiture tradition of Palmyra was rediscovered, and many of these portraits made their ways into first European collections and later American collections. And I show you here the one that is on display at the Getty upstairs, which you can go and have a look at. Actually a very nice example of these portraits. Already in 1890s, a Danish scholar, who I'll talk a bit about later in the lecture, Johannes Østrup, visited Palmyra and describes how vandalism and European collectors are actually driving the destruction at the site at this point in time. Because of course, with the rediscovery of the site and these portraits which hold quite an aesthetic value, European collectors who were collecting Greek and Roman antiquities also became very interested in the portraiture culture of the Near East and more importantly, Palmyra as such, and began to collect these extensively. We might say today, as the situation is, that that's quite a good situation that so many made it out of Syria, but that is a very political topic to discuss also, and I won't go into details with that today. These portraits that stem from the funerary sphere were set up in funerary monuments in Palmyra. They are so-called loculus reliefs, and they covered burial niches in monumental elite funerary monuments. So they were put up in front of burial slots, so the mummified body was put behind, and the portrait of the individual, very often accompanied by an inscription, giving us the name of the individual that was lying behind, inside the niche, and the genealogy of the family in up to 5 generations. So there were really a focus both on the one hand on the individual, but also on the family history. Sometimes even more individuals of one family were depicted, so fathers with their sons, husbands with their wives, uncles with nephews and nieces. So there was a wide span in the sort of family constellations that were shown on these portraits. And that's what makes them so interesting. So they were either put up in these monumental tower tombs that were introduced in the 1st century AD in Palmyra, so completely a new form of burial monuments in this region. We only know a couple of these towers from the Euphrates region at Dura Europos, but otherwise they are basically unique to Palmyra, up to 6 or 7 stories high sometimes. And later, the underground tombs, the hypogea, were introduced in the desert landscape as well. And it was in these monuments that these portraits were put up and ended up forming extensive family galleries over generations and generations. Later, also the so-called banqueting reliefs were introduced, and very elaborate sarcophagi, which sometimes on the lids could comprise as many as 13 family members being showed, with a focus on the paterfamilias lying on a clines or a banqueting couch, enjoying life with his family. So much research until now has really focused on quite small groups of these, so 200 portraits or special collections, so on and so forth, and no corpus has existed of these. And this was my reason for initiating this project, which I could begin with the funding from the Carlsberg Foundation. I'll talk about the foundation's history as well, because it's quite interesting, on 1st of January 2012. It had been in planning for quite a while, but as it is with funding, it takes a while to get the funding application through. So we had, of course, already set up all the agreements with Syria and with the general director in Palmyra of going there to document everything that was in the storages, in the graves, still in situ, and in the other museums. That, of course, could not happen because after January 2012, it was simply too dangerous to visit Syria. The reason for the project is really that these funerary portraits constitute the largest corpus of portraits, so representations of individuals from the Roman period outside of Rome. I estimated, and I was really wrong, and I'll tell you the right number, that approximately 1,500 existed across the world in museums, collections, and in situ. They have a very tight chronological framework. They were only made from the 1st century AD until the 3rd century AD, when Palmyra was sacked in 273 by the Romans. And last but not least, the largest collection outside of Syria is in the New Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, and I'm based in Denmark, and that made a good point of departure. So Carl Jacobsen, who was the brewer and the owner of the breweries together with his father, was a very visionary collector. The New Carlsberg Glyptotek really houses one of the most world-famous portrait collections of Greek and Roman portraiture. But on the side of this, Carl Jacobsen also already in the late 19th century collected an extensive collection of the Palmyrene funerary portraits, because as he wrote to his agent in Beirut, the Danish consul Leutwill, these would be extremely important to compare with Roman period portraiture in order to see which trends and fashions in Palmyra were important. And the first catalog was done by Rabbi David Simonsen in 1889, while the old Glyptotek, which is not open to the public anymore, still was holding the Palmyra collection. And Carl Jacobsen was even so visionary that he bought a Palmyrene mummy. And I have been looking for this mummy for some years because the Glyptotek actually couldn't find it. They had one too many in the Egyptian collections, and we first thought that it might have been this one, but it actually wasn't. And we now discovered the letter where the mummy arrives from Palmyra in Copenhagen, and they open the box and it simply dissolves. And this can actually happen. So I don't know what they're going to do with the extra mummy in the Egyptian department, but unfortunately it is not this one, which could have been very interesting, of course, for us to do analysis on. So let me just stay a little bit with the story about Carl Jacobsen and the New Carlsberg Glyptotek and the Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters, of which I'm lucky to be a member. So Carl Jacobsen, he sponsored the new home for the Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters, and he also founded the Carlsberg Foundation to be housed in the same building and only to be constituted by members of the Royal Academy. But on top of that, he actually endowed the breweries to the Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters, and we hold 52% of the shares in Carlsberg Brewery AS, and the director is always recruited from the Royal Academy, and he's also, or she, the head of the board of the brewery. And that's a unique constellation, having the second largest brewery in the world being run by academics. But this, in effect, also means that we are actually only allowed, and that is true, to drink Carlsberg beer at dinner after academy meetings, and that I potentially could end up running the second largest brewery in the world one day, should I perhaps not fail at university? But that is a potential possibility. But the Carlsberg Foundation has a very long-standing tradition for supporting research in the Middle East. Already in the late 19th century, they sponsored Johannes Elid Østrup, who was a young and upcoming scholar and who traveled on horseback from Cairo to Copenhagen over 2 years. And he was funded by, and even his horse was funded by, the Carlsberg Foundation. He had a very interesting career. He ended his days as the rector of Copenhagen University, but he also held the first professorship ever in Islamic studies at University of Copenhagen, which was instituted very early in the 20th century. And that is also a quite interesting history, but I won't go into that now. On the way through Syria, he heard about Palmyra and decided to spend months and months mapping out parts of the Syrian desert, including Palmyra, and he went there and discovered some tombs, and he also bought further objects for the collection at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek. So 7 objects that we have not known where came from until now, actually through our archival research, has turned out to come from his travels in Syria. Harald Ingholt, who was another Danish scholar, took up this work. He wrote his habilitation, Studier over Palmyrene sculpture. This is why I have an upper hand in working with Palmyrene sculpture, because that only exists in Danish, this book, and is the, until now, largest collection of these portraits, actually. But as you see here, Harald Ingholt had a very interesting career and actually spent many, many years as chair of Near Eastern archaeology at Yale University. There were reasons for this, because he won a scholarship to go around the world, and on a boat from China to Japan, he met his American wife, and her mother's family was very well connected, and that meant that he could move to the States. In the beginning, they actually lived in Denmark, but because of the Second World War, they decided to flee over Sweden to the United States. After the war, of course, he was several times in Denmark again, and I'll talk a little bit about how his archives came back. He conducted extensive fieldwork in Palmyra in the 20s and 30s, and I recently met his 90-year-old daughter in New York, who went with him on many of these exhibitions and could tell amazing stories about the scholarly networks that he was part of in this very important and formative part of classical archaeology in the Middle East. Last year, we had an exhibition in Aarhus on his work in Palmyra, and also brought out a book in Danish and in English on his work in Palmyra. He collected for his habilitation a large, extensive paper archive comprising all what he knew of Palmyrene sculpture. And that archive is now housed at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek, where it's been neatly housed for more than 20 years and standing on shelves until we came by and asked whether we couldn't digitalize it and actually concord it with the whole database. And that has given extremely interesting insights into objects' biographies, because we can now begin to trace how some objects, at least, have moved around in collections around the world. And these were stories we didn't know before. One example is that it actually turns out that Ingholt also bought quite a few new pieces for the New Carlsberg Glyptotek. For example, this one, which until now has always, well, it says in the archives of the Glyptotek that it was bought by Ingholt in Beirut. But in fact now we can show through the archive that it stems directly from his own excavations in Palmyra, was taken to Beirut, taxed by the French governor, and thereafter shipped to Denmark. This is another field photo showing Ingholt in 1937 during his excavations of the famous tomb of Malcolm. So this letter won't tell you very much, because that's also in Danish, but that's the thank you letter from the director of the Glyptotek, thanking Ingholt for sending back the archive. Ingholt unfortunately became quite senile in his older days and decided, before it got very bad, to send back the archive, or send it to New Carlsberg Glyptotek so that it could be with the collection where he felt that it belonged. And as you see here in the archive, what he did on this paper archive was really to give all references of the sculptures, all collections, which are very important today, so a lot of Lebanese private collections that we didn't know of, and he also basically did family genealogies where he could. I here show a drawing from his habilitation defense, where other famous Scandinavian scholars have shown testing his knowledge of Palmyra, and this is the front page of his big monograph. He did a very strict typology of the Palmyrene funerary portraits, really based on stylistic developments and inscriptions also. And then you might think, well, why bother with actually making a comprehensive corpus if he already did part of the work? Well, it is, as it says, I've been working on portraiture for many years, and it is now the largest corpus of portraits from the Roman period. And I was dead wrong when I estimated that there was 1,500 examples, because we are up to a bit more than 3,000 in the database now, making this even outgrow what we have of Roman period portraits from Rome, for example. So it's really significant. And again, the tight chronological framework, and that we can even precisely date some of these through inscriptions where the year of death is actually given. Also, the fact that statistical analysis really becomes much more reliable if you have more than 1,000. We can now also prove that, and Ingholt only had access to about 800 of these. Last but not least, of course, the escalating situation in Syria really shows what documentation projects can do and what value they hold. And you, of course, all know now where Palmyra lies, namely in the Syrian desert between the Euphrates River and the Mediterranean. We know it, unfortunately, mostly through the horrific pictures that we see in the media and last year saw on a daily basis after ISIS took the city. It was state-held before then. Some of the first monuments that were blown up were actually early Islamic saint monuments and not the Roman period monuments. It also talks to us about the ideologies of these various organizations, if we might call them. So this is one of the photos of Palmyrene funerary portraits, which have been transported to northern Syria, Raqqa, and actually probably was thought to be exported over the border, but here is being smashed in public. This is Khaled al-Assad, who was the general director of the site for more than 40 years and was beheaded on the ancient main street and hung on one of the columns. So this is a site that really has gone through now a very sad history. I'm not going to focus very much on that today because I think there are positive things to be done as well, but there will be a large work to be done when this conflict hopefully ends. There's, of course, a very ideological reason that ISIS wanted to take Palmyra again, not least because it was the place where the largest political prison in Syria was located. There was a huge underground complex that housed more than 3,000 political prisoners, and this was one of the first things that was destroyed when ISIS took the city. And it is, of course, lying in a very important infrastructural point in the desert. So, I mean, it was on the Silk Route in antiquity, and it's still on the motorway from the Euphrates to Damascus. So, infrastructurally, it was a very important site. We unfortunately know pictures of the entrance to the Baal temple, which looked like that before. We have, luckily in the archives, just to put a bit of a positive spin, found some of the medieval structure drawings done by Charles Christensen, a Danish architect who worked with Ingholt in the 1920s. So, of course, this is also partly a reconstruction, but it doesn't make it any better that it was blown up. Because actually, until the 1940s, when real archaeological work began, there was a whole village inside the sanctuary of Baal, which has also been removed in the process of the excavations. So the archive again gives us information about this earlier village also. very lovely Balshamin temple was also destroyed, and the museum, unfortunately, has also undergone a lot of damage. There's been a lot of polemic in the media about the Syrian state trying to tell that the situation was not as bad, but actually now several missions have visited Palmyra, and the situation is unfortunately very bad. But as scholars, we know Palmyra as Pearl of the Desert, as an amazing city that really flourished in the first 3 centuries AD. We know it for Zenobia, who during her very short reign actually invaded and conquered Egypt and also expanded what became the Palmyrene Empire wide into Asia Minor. And that was, of course, very unsettling for the Romans because they were getting quite a bit of tax money from Palmyra, being basically the last stop on the Silk Route. And Emperor Aurelian sacked the city twice, and the second time it never really raised again. So life in the city did not end, but the city became much, much smaller, and we do not have archaeological evidence for the portrait habit, for example, after the 3rd century AD. We know Palmyra also for the amazing architecture, mixes of Eastern and Western traditions coming together in these temple complexes, in the tombs. This is the famous Tower of Ilhabela. You see stuccoed columns, Corinthian pilasters, and coffered ceilings with a lot of coloring still in situ on these portraits, because these are actually also portraits of dead Palmyrenes. We know it for the extremely frontally Eastern-focused art. This is a relief showing the 3 main gods of Palmyra, Bel, Yaribol, and Aklibol, found in the sanctuary of Bel. But we also know it for imported marble statues. Marble was not indigenous to the Near East, so all statues we find of marble in the Near East must have been imported. And this is a copy of a statue done by the Greek sculptor Phidias, so an Athena statue, cult statue, that was most likely put up in the temple of Alat in the city and used as a cult statue in the Roman period. Unfortunately, that has also undergone quite a bit of damage in the since ISIS took the city as well. We have the rich funerary monuments, and I also show you here some of the wall paintings using Roman mythological themes in a Palmyrene setting. So this was really not what we might term a melting pot, but really a place where conscious local choices that drew on a very high level of knowledge took place. So choices went on in the public and private sphere about what was shown and why things were shown as they were. We always call Palmyra a desert city, but what one needs to know is that it was actually more of a steppe desert that surrounded Palmyra. A lot of the year there was water in all the wadis going all the way out to Euphrates, and that of course made agriculture around the city a possibility for parts of the years. And a big Norwegian survey project working in the region before the conflict has also shown that there were a lot of villages situated in the region around Palmyra. Here you see quite a schematic view of trade routes in the Roman period, and you see that the Silk Route, so to say, had a big stop in Palmyra, and these trade routes, or the importance of the trade, is of course also reflected in the art of Palmyra. On this fantastic relief down here, you actually see a ship lying in water while the owner holds his hand on the prow, but in the other hand, he's actually holding his camel. So this is East and West meeting, or traditions of trading, meeting and being visualized in the arts. And here you see one of the riding camels. We know that it's not a caravan camel because it has a saddle on top of it, but of course you would also ride these camels in the caravans. The knowledge of trade is also expressed in the bilingual tax tariff of 137 AD, which is now in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, that gives us a lot of information about how trade was conducted and what was done at the site, what things cost, how much it cost to reload from a camel to the donkey caravans, which would go west from Palmyra, because camels don't do mountains very well. So we know that big mules or donkeys were the ones that took over the role of the camel when they went towards the Mediterranean coast. And this is a fascinating document giving us a lot of information about trade and objects of trade. But Palmyrenes were very good military people as well. On the very well-known column of Trajan in Rome, which the fewest of us really have inspected because it's quite difficult to get to see the reliefs. But the reliefs actually show us different campaigns of the wars that took place during the reign of the Emperor Trajan. And on one of these reliefs, we have a few Palmyrene archers here depicted in the Dacian wars. We also have gravestones of Palmyrene soldiers in Britain, for example, so they got around, and we also know that they were stationed on the Euphrates. So, of course, also in the course of being companions of the caravans, because we know that they took military along caravans, they also served in the Roman army. And it was really this rise in wealth and military power that gave way to innovation and expansion of the urban site from the late 1st century BC, and also gave the possibility of this rich portrait habit to be introduced in the early 1st century AD. These actually very unique, more than bust-size portraits of people, because they actually show the individual down to the navel, so to say. So you have the whole body, upper body, to display things and textiles and attributes on, become more than a portrait, but really a representation of the individual. And they were, of course, for the elite of Palmyra, or upper middle class, and some of them are quite down to earth. I mean, has very simple Greek clothing. But these two examples from the Louvre here are very decorative, hold extremely representations of very fine textiles, and so on and so forth. A lot of jewelry is what the women can wear as well. And they were put up in front of these locust slabs and closed the burial niches in commemoration of the dead person. Here I just show you a plan of one of these underground hypogea where up to 400 people could be buried, and the same goes for the tower tombs that also became these large mass graves over generations and make up these portrait galleries of families with the founder in the center, often together with one of his sons. In the public sphere, the evidence is quite different. You see all these consoles on the streets of the main streets and side streets of Palmyra. In antiquity, actually held sculpture as well. That has, of course, been lost over the centuries and centuries, often made in limestone, but also in marble or even in bronze, but has fallen down, has been remelted, and so on and so forth. So we do not have very many of these sculptures from the public sphere. But what we do have is more than 180 inscriptions going along with these statues, but being inscribed underneath these consoles, telling us about these Palmyrene individuals and their civic offices and the importance that they held in Palmyrene society. So in the public sphere, we also see, as we do in the funerary sphere, that dress codes are combined, Parthian banqueting clothing, that in the funerary sphere is restricted to the banqueting scene, but used for honorific sculpture in the public sphere. Here we see more Greek-style himation, and the same goes for this smaller statue. So there was a lot of identity choices going on in the public sphere as well, according to where you located these statues and where they were going to be displayed. I just show you here, unfortunately, a little bit of a bad slide. I couldn't get better photos, but a little bit of the bronze sculpture we still have left, and must imagine the combination of different materials in the public sphere. And here, some marble statues, which were again imported, but definitely worked in Palmyra, because you see how flat they are. They were meant to stand on these column consoles and lean back a little bit so not to fall down on the viewer. Palmyra was also what we actually might term the only bilingual city in the Near East. There is an immense amount of Greek and Palmyrene Aramaic inscriptions in the public sphere, and I show you one here talking actually about Zenobia's family. However, in the funerary sphere, we have an exclusive focus on Palmyrene Aramaic. So we've recorded all these inscriptions in the project as well, and where we have 1,101 objects with inscriptions on. There can be several inscriptions on one object. This is one object, but it holds 3 inscriptions. We have 1,064 Palmyrene Aramaic, only 32 in Greek, and only 5 in Latin. And until now, people have said, oh, they used a lot of Greek in the funerary sphere as well, but I think these numbers speak clearly for themselves and show that they didn't really care about anything than their local language in the graves. Often, the non-Palmyrene Aramaic grave inscriptions are of military people who died in Palmyra, held high positions, and obviously their families, so they might have decided, if they commissioned the portrait themselves before they died, that they wanted to have their inscription, for example, in Latin. And usually these portraits also sort of follow the imperial style portraits of the emperor reigning the empire at the point in time. So we have this immense combination of identities through a number of factors, including dress and language, and a very high awareness about which spheres one were acting in. So the public, the private, or the funerary sphere. Greek costume was very commonly used on these grave slabs and the Parthian in the banqueting reliefs. And the Palmyrene priests wear very significant clothes, decorated tunics with a big cloak, and these so-called modius hats, round, flat hats, often depicting earlier priests in the family. Female portraits, interestingly, make up 40% of the funerary portraits, and that's also something new we can show now with the corpus. It's always been said that women accompanied their men, but single portraits of women are the most common on the loculus relief, so they were commemorated actually in their own right. But in the banqueting reliefs, which are very conservative reliefs in many ways, that we know the Totenmal motif from all over the Roman Empire, they are usually companions of their husbands and sons. Their dress really develops very elaborately over time and becomes extremely abundant as the wealth of Palmyra increases in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. And we, of course, can now also investigate whether this is a reflection of fashion changes, societal changes, or perhaps simply also a question of production economy in these reliefs. Even children make up a very distinct group of representations. So there are quite a few, 132 children portraits, and there are even single portraits of children. In the banqueting scenes, they are very, very common, and up to 8 children of a family could be represented also. We have no idea about how many inhabitants Palmyra had in antiquity. People say anything between 25,000 and 125, and that's a very broad span, so I don't try to speculate in these things. But these comprised family constellations with up to 8 children of the family, of course, gives us some insight into what average we might be speaking about. And these are, on the basis of all these collections around the world, and we've been in many places, we've been able to draw this research together. So in the very tailor-made database, which we developed with programmers over half a year, we have registered every single detail on every single object and portrait over the last 4 years. And now, for the first time, really, it's possible to examine a string of these phenomena in Palmyra across 300 years, which is really unique for scholars of the ancient world. Now we can also say that they come in various constellations and how the different ratios are. That single portraits commemorating one individual is really the most common, but we also have double and multiple portrait constellations, banqueting scenes, but most interesting also that the emphasis is always on the family and family relations exclusive. So not on the civic offices, which really stands in contrast to what has been encountered in the public sphere. And I just show you here the dry numbers from before we hit 3,000, and here you clearly see that representations of the individual is the most common one. One neat example about which I'm trying to finish a book is the Palmyrene priests, because almost 20% of the male representations show priest. And that is a significant number. So we can't really imagine that every fifth man we meet on the street in Palmyra in antiquity would have gone around dressed up as a Palmyrene priest. So I've done quite a bit of research on that in combination with the epigraphic material, and have been able to show also that it's because the priesthood structure in Palmyra actually was not based on Roman models, but much more based again on the tribal model of the societal constellation of Palmyra. So priesthoods were inherited, or not only inherited, but extended on male family members by fathers and by uncles. So it was not a profession at all, but much rather a societal status position that you could put on and take off as you needed to at certain points of the year, for example. Ingholt did, as many archaeologists do, excavate way too much. So he excavated more than 40 graves in Palmyra, but he did not publish very many of these. But we have found 6 of his until now unpublished excavation diaries, which of course now, in the light also of the situation, give us unique information. And I have these forthcoming with a French colleague who's done all the inscriptions in a monograph series that I founded in the Royal Academy. And here you, for example, see his detailed notes on sarcophagi that he found, and he even marked the different colors that were still in place on the sarcophagi, and which of course have disappeared over the years. So these diaries give us unique insight into his earlier work. Last year, we also published an article on the masterpiece in the Palmyrene collection in New Carlsberg Glyptothek, the so-called Beauty of Palmyra, which until then had been said to have been bought by a French Jew in Damascus. But if you look in Ingholt's diaries, and this part is in Danish, he also would write in English or in French or in German if he felt like it, but that was his Danish day. He tells us that the most beautiful female bust he ever had seen with colors, he found one afternoon during excavations in Qasr Abjad, which is a family grave in Palmyra that we know that he excavated. He also says it's now in the Glyptothek, and the Rask Ørsted Foundation paid for it. So we can now show exactly where in this grave it came from, and the grave has been, or one plan of the grave has been published, but we could now, through the archival research we've done, publish 9 other sculptures that until now has not been known to come from this grave, and really tell much more about the private elite culture in the tombs. And just one other example of this archaeology, which I'm a great fan of, is this niche in the so-called tomb of Hayran, which he also excavated. But he picked the nice pieces, so he only published this, etc., but we know that he excavated the whole tomb. And these are 2 watercolors done by the architect Charles Christensen, who he had with him, and you can see that they come from this niche, and they actually show statues, honorific statues, which originally were placed in the public sphere in Palmyra, but here brought into the funerary sphere. And here we see Hayran, and on the other side his wife was located, and we must imagine that the localist reliefs of these people had been sitting somewhere here also. So basically the public sphere was brought into the funerary sphere in this case. And you can see that there are statues because they're standing on bases here. And you can even see the base here. I found the diary with all the sketches of all the excavated tombs, because at least he did his work properly. And we've now been able to recontextualize this, etc., within the much larger family tomb. And it gives very interesting insight into how these tombs developed, because we know from legal texts from Palmyra that you could sell parts of your grave to other families, and you could even allow them to take down 50 burials from your family, destroy them, make a larger niche, which is probably what happened here, because Hayran founded the tomb. We know that from the Session inscription on the front, and this used to be the central niche, and at some later point, maybe his son or grandsons sold off part of the grave, and a new family, a branch of the family, could extend it. So this is wonderful archaeology when you cannot work on a site itself. But of course, one of the outcomes of the data collection has really been the unforeseen due to the escalating conflict in Syria, and we decided to systematically go through auction catalogs. And of course, we're able to see that already since 2011, there's been a steady increase in the number of Palmyrene funerary portraits on the international art market. And we can count around 60, and I'm sure we've not covered everything. Another thing is also, of course, the massive destruction and looting, export of cultural goods, but also an exploding falsification industry. Misinformation is also something that we need to deal with. Last year, these pictures went worldwide around the supposed destruction of the very famous Ilhabela's tower. So 27th of August, no damage. 2nd of September, no damage. There's no doubt that this monument was in fact destroyed, but it was not the Tower of Ilhabela, because if you look at this closely, you can see this has a central door, it has several windows and a side door as well, and the Tower of Ilhabela does not carry any of these features. So we are also presented with having to filter the information that we get from the media, and this is where I think that scholars should engage themselves much more than they're doing now. We also have misinformation about looting of tombs, wrong numbers of portraits, because we can now see that we've registered all these portraits, and when they are looted, a different number of portraits is given as haven't been looted, but the grave is empty. So where do all these extra portraits go? That's, of course, not something we can solve, but we can say it is a problem. You can buy these things on eBay. I mean, don't do it, but they are for sale out there. Come with dodgy provenance papers, but that's not difficult. Unfortunately, much more of this kind of activity is going on than can be monitored. But of course, what we cannot monitor is the so-called black market, where the activity really is taking place. So I'm currently involved in making a documentary about movements of illicitly exported cultural good, and we have a database of freshly dug Palmyrene funerary portraits for sale in Gaziantep in Turkey, close to the Syrian border. And here you see that they are freshly excavated because many of them carry extensive color traces, which you usually won't have if they've been in circulation for quite a while. But we also have an exploding falsification industry. So done in the local limestone again, by people who obviously are very used to seeing Palmyrene funerary portraits, but still want to personalize them a little bit. And these climbing kits on mother's shoulders is not something that Palmyrenes did, but something that slips into these falsifications, which are obviously being bought by various collectors as well. So there's a whole own trajectory and sad story, I think, in this local production economy that this falsification industry, spurred by the power vacuum, tells. Namely, that people are desperate also to survive and will do everything. I mean, what we can say also is that the dealer routes seem to stay the same, but the expansion of the business is immense. We also have some dilemmas which arise due to the increasing destruction concerning publication of our research results, because as said, he excavated more than 40 graves, but only published a few, and until recently we did not know the location of these graves. But in the archives, I also found the papers giving us the exact location and maps of all these graves, and we now know where in Palmyra they were actually situated. But of course, I cannot publish this officially yet, because if I contextualize that in a map of Palmyra, it might actually give people who should not have the information about where these graves are. But let me come to the conclusion, and all I want to say is that despite the very sad situation, I think we in the Palmyra Portrait Project has shown that through documentation, we still have quite a lot to rediscover in Palmyra. And we hope to, with the information that we are collecting and also making available to the public, because the database will, when it's finished, go online and be open to everybody, really hope to feed into also the whole dialogue, which we hope that we will enter with the world when the conflict ends, that documentation projects are very important and that we should do them at as early a point as possible at all. In the case of Syria, it's too late for many sites, but there are many other regions where it will be possible to actually take these preventive measures. And then I should, of course, thank the whole team, because I'm not doing this alone. I have very many good students and good colleagues who engage themselves in the work that we do. And these things could also not be possible without the funding of the Carlsberg Foundation. So do drink Carlsberg beer. And it is true, the money goes to the foundation, or because the foundation owns the breweries, you now know that story. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. We have time for some questions from the audience. We have microphones on either side, so please raise your hand and wait for the microphone and then ask your question. We'll start down here in front, then John, and then we'll go to the left.
I know you've concentrated on Palmyra, but I was wondering what has happened, if anything, at Dura Europos, and are there any restoration or conservation efforts there?
Well, the sad thing is, of course, that well, you can Google Earth this, and you will see that Dura Europos looks like numerous rabbit holes. It's been extensively looted, like Palmyra, like many other sites, and currently no conservation measures can be taken in this region. That's simply impossible. But so I only know this situation from colleagues, and we don't get a lot of information out from Syria right now. But I mean, if you look at satellite images, I mean, extensive damage has been done to that site as well also. I mean, we still hope that the things that are in Damascus already, like the synagogue frescoes and the church, are still there in place. But of course, we don't know what happened to all the, until now, undocumented things and unexcavated parts of Dura Europos. Yeah.
John?
Thank you, that was a great talk. I have a question about the some of these figures that are reclining and seated that are headless. Can you tell from the patination whether these were taken by Europeans in the modern era, or does this go back to late antiquity when the Christians mutilated many images, like the Alat statue that you showed?
Yeah.
How much Christian destruction was at Palmyra, do you know?
That has actually never really been something that people have worked on, and it's very interesting because we actually have these sources from the late 19th century, as I mentioned, where Østrup actually describes vandalism. Also, this is of course in a later period, but he actually also describes that earlier vandalism had taken place. So this is definitely something that's worth an article, worth in looking into. What we have is, of course, an immense amount of loose heads in the database from collections, because it was the heads, as you say, that were really taken also to be sold on because they were easy. And we can now begin to recontextualize some of these on some of the sculptures, but it's of course something that takes an immense amount of time, and we can't go see these things. So it has to be done through sort of digital imaging and those sorts of
You
things.
can usually tell by the freshness of the break.
Yes, yeah.
Whether it's in the modern
Yeah.
period or...
Yeah, but whether it's in the modern period, 200 years ago, or 1,000, can be quite, can be quite difficult.
200 years ago, you can still see that some of the fresh
Sorry. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's definitely something that we have on our screen, but we've until now not looked at that systematically, but rather looked systematically at whether we can put heads and figures together. Yeah.
In the back there, we have 2 questions. 3 questions in the back, so we'll do all 3 of those as soon as the microphones get there.
Thank you. Did they drink beer at Palmyra?
Not as far as we know, but we have inscriptions telling us about the fact that they drank wine and that you were more popular if you served imported wine at your banquets than if you served the local Palmyrene wine. So unfortunately, it doesn't seem as if they had very good grapes in Palmyra. Yeah.
Gentleman in the pink, and then there was another gentleman next.
Thank you. I understand that there was quite a bit of Greek and Roman appropriation in the art and funerary, but is there any evidence of Sasanian linguistic inscription or art, relief, things like that? And in that same vein, has the modern government of Iran shown any interest in helping, support Palmyra projects?
Not as, to answer the last part of your question first, I do not know of any initiatives from the Iranian side to sort of support initiatives there. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some, of course, because I do not know everything. As for the Sasanian influence, I think definitely, and this is a whole other talk I could have done, the influence in the clothing style, if you look at the sculptures from Hatra, for example, it's definitely there. So this whole Eastern banqueting tradition and influence in the visual arts, and also very much in the stylistic motif with the very stiff standing motifs and so on and so forth is certainly there. But as far as we can see in the inscriptions, there is no influence. And I would also not say that, and I hope I did make that clear, but there's not a substantial Greek or Roman influence in the linguistics. We really have very few in the funerary sphere inscriptions attesting to Greek and Latin. That's much more in the public sphere, but again, that's Palmyrenes using the Greek language in the public sphere, and not people who came to Palmyra, but to show off that they really were, able to navigate in a global world.
We had a question in the middle in the back.
These
Yes.
sculptures show an extremely high degree of skill and artistic talent. Do you know anything about the sculptures? Were there guilds? Were there families that passed down tradition of doing these works?
That's a very good question. No workshop has been found, but a tiny part of Palmyra has been excavated. It's really only monuments around the main street. As it goes with these places, that's what researchers have focused on. We can definitely define workshops in the sculptures. There's the crazy eye workshop, for example, that do big round eyes, and there's the long ear workshop, and we need to come up with better names for this when we publish it, I realize. But it is something we've been discussing a lot. Okay, we have more than 3,000 of these, and that is fantastic. But it's not that many over 300 years. So how many workshops would you need? And how would they be organized? We simply, until now, have no idea, but I just employed a new PhD student who's going to look at the local production economy, and I hope that we, together with her, can sort of push this further, because it's definitely worth. I expect that we are looking at much fewer workshops than we would have thought. Maybe 3, 4, but that's just something I'm throwing out right now. We should look at the evidence first. Yeah.
Here in the back, yes.
Could you give a description of the tomb towers in terms of perhaps the diameter,
Yeah.
the height?
I mean, they can be up to 20 meters high or a bit more, and they can be, 10 meters broad. I mean, they were really very massive monuments. The earlier ones tend to be a little bit less elaborate. And we actually have one example where a family decides, oh, that was too crappy what we did. We are going to build one that's much larger next to it. And then they actually connected the two ones with underground tunnels. But that's a very unique example. But they are massive monuments, up to 7 stories high.
How many have you been able to find?
Sorry?
I'm sorry.
They have actually, I mean, the ones that are known have actually been published in 2013 by a German scholar who did her dissertation on these before, I mean, already in the early 2000s. And I think she documented around 98, but more existed, of course, but of some of them only foundations are left, and some have been massively reconstructed also. But there were many more than 100. But they also went out of use. So in the 2nd century, when the hypogea, or late 1st century, when the hypogea were introduced also, they became the more popular form. Maybe because they were easier to extend. When you had done a tower, you couldn't really put on another story. You could add an underground tomb, which was done in some cases. But the hypogea seemed to take over as the main funerary monument.
Don't see any. One last question here, please.
Hi. Is there any description in the archives of preferences that the 19th century expeditions to Palmyra had, like what they preferred to bring back, or was it sort of anything portable?
Well, the real expeditions only sort of started later, but the portraits really have, and the public sculpture has been something there's been a big focus on. What we do know in the case of Carl Jacobsen is that he wanted a representative collection. He said, I do not want only the good ones, I also want the crappy ones, because I want to show the span of the quality of these sculptures, and that really means that it's a unique collection in Copenhagen because it really shows everything, whereas the Louvre, which has a lovely collection, has many very good pieces, but not very many basic pieces. So that has also had a big influence on what has been said in scholarship about these portraits, because scholars have been working on the basis of the museum collections that were driven by museums and collectors. So that's actually had a big impact on what has been said until now about these things. And I mean, I can also not say that I've looked at all archives, because that's not been possible, but I'm sure that there would be more things to find out about these agendas if one could have a look at these.
Well, I think it just remains for us to once again thank Professor Raja for a fascinating lecture on a very important, wide-ranging topic. Thank you so very much.